It is Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018. I'm in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. And just re-chalked the slogan that I put down 2 days ago on Friday. Friday was PurpleSummer, which is a day dedicated to speaking out against child sex abuse in general. Child abuse in general, and child sex abuse in particular. It was started by a victim of child sex abuse in England by the name of David Lean, who was abused by his soccer coach, and there were actually many other victims of that abuse. It's my understanding that David Lean was recently able to have that soccer coach put away for quite some time. He had previously been imprisoned, but he had been released, and by bringing forward his complaint and other people's complaints, David Lean was able to get this sexually abusing soccer coach put away in prison again. So that was good work on the part of David, and his PurpleSummer hashtag campaign seems to be having some success, at least in terms of Twitter, but also getting some mainstream media attention. I know that David Lean was interviewed on Sky News in England, so he was able to get some mainstream media press coverage of his PurpleSummer campaign. So we're basically continuing PurpleSummer into Sunday here, and as I said, these chalk slogans here, this was put down Friday. The inner third of it was basically wiped out by people walking over it, scuffing it kind of thing, but the outer 2/3 was still there. So I just basically re-chalked everything, and it does say Unitarians cover up and deny sexual abuse of children, and it's an entirely truthful statement that is supported by the fact that in terms of trying to cover up sexual abuse of children, the Unitarian Universalist Association hired Stikeman Elliott barristers and solicitors defamation lawyer Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe to falsely accuse me of the criminal act of blasphemous libel just over 6 years ago on June 1st of 2012. And the purpose of this false accusation of violating Canada's anti-blasphemy law was to intimidate me into removing blog posts about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, who was charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape and indeed the unnatural rape of teenage Tibetan refugees who he lured away from their parents in India with promises of a better life in America. Basically, he said he would, take them under his wing and make sure they got an education. He probably also promised that he'd do his best to get them U.S. citizenship and so on. I should mention that today is also Father's Day. So Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell essentially took teenage Tibetan refugees away from their fathers and mothers with promises of a better life in America, and then proceeded to sexually exploit them for a time measured in years in at least one case. One of his earlier victims, her name is Funtsock, I won't give her family name, she was taken away at 16 and 16 years of age, and Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell basically made her his personal sex slave for a number of years. She finally ran away when she was in her early 20s. So basically at least 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years of being a sex slave of Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell of the Westboro and Northboro Unitarian Universalist congregations in Massachusetts. And then getting back to Unitarian Universalist fathers, there's also Richard Buell, a parishioner from First Parish Norwell in Massachusetts. So he's not a Unitarian Universalist minister, but nonetheless the Unitarian Universalist Association tried to get me to remove blog posts about Richard Buell as well in this false blasphemous libel accusation they brought against me. The exact words of the accusation were your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory. And then it went on to say that they're so defamatory that they constitute the criminal act of blasphemous libel. Now, I'd never seen the term blasphemous libel before, but when I looked it up, it became clear that in the Canadian Criminal Code, there's a fairly undetailed and terse anti-blasphemy law that prohibits what's called a blasphemous libel against religious communities. And the Unitarian Universalist Association, via its Stikeman Elliott barristers and solicitors representative, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, was threatening to have me charged with the criminal act of blasphemous libel for blogging about Unitarian Universalists who'd been charged, tried, and convicted of pedophilia and rape. There was nothing unfounded about my blog posts about Richard Buell and Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell. And then there's the other Unitarian Universalist ministers, actual ministers, who were also charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children that I hadn't even blogged about and hadn't named. Anyway, it's Father's Day, so let's talk about a father by the name of Richard Buell. Well, he was charged, tried, and convicted of the rape of a neighbor's daughter, but also a female family member. That's what the news report said, a female family member. And when one considers that Richard Buell was in his mid to late 50s when these rapes of preteen children took place, or did I forget to mention they were under 12 years old? Well, yeah, I'm getting to that anyway. So the victims, in terms of these charges and the conviction, were no older than 12 years old at the times that the rapes took place, and could have been as young as 6 according to some estimates. Let's say somewhere between 9 and 12. So Richard Buell, I described as a pedophile rapist because that's exactly what he was. He raped preteen, prepubescent girls. And he was charged, tried, and convicted of those despicable crimes. Anyway, he essentially, it doesn't say exactly which female family member we're talking about here, but it's almost certainly a granddaughter or possibly a grandniece. But it's I would suspect most likely a granddaughter, especially in light of the fact that it was also reported in other media, perhaps less reliable media, but nonetheless probably just as truthful, that Richard Buell also sexually abused and raped his own daughters. You know, so he was a father who abused his own daughters, but his daughters were unable to bring charges against him because the statute of limitations ran out. And so they were, you know, sexually abused by their father, Richard Buell, but they were unable to obtain justice in a court of law because Massachusetts statute of limitations on reporting such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape ran out before they got around to reporting the rape. But nonetheless, what happened is I believe they became aware that their own daughters, or perhaps it was, again, it could have been a niece or something. But anyways, it became clear that Richard Buell was still sexually abusing and even raping female family members, in this case a probable granddaughter or grandniece. So yeah, there's one rather despicable Unitarian Universalist father we can talk about on Father's Day. And then there's all the fathers that help cover up and hide this stuff. I mean, you know, the slogan here says Unitarian Universalists or Unitarians cover up and deny sex abuse of children. So I've spoken about one of the ways where they cover it up. But in terms of outright denial of sexual abuse of children, a father by the name of James See No Evil Key, also known as Jim Key, moderator of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or at least he was, going back in 2013, 2014, and so on. Jim Key, in June of 2014, so just around 4 years ago now, stood up in front of the thousands of Unitarian Universalist delegates during the 2014 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association and delivered a, as far as I'm concerned, completely worthless official apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. So this official apology, I believe it was an official apology of the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Association as represented by the chairman of the board, that is UUA moderator Jim Key, apologized, in quotation marks, to victims of clergy sexual misconduct committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. Now, most of the victims are adults, and so this was primarily about, many women and probably some men as well being victims of one kind of sexual misconduct or another. And in that so-called apology, Jim Key minimized everything. He played down the extent and seriousness of the sexual misconduct, tried to pretend it was just a few Unitarian Universalist ministers who were guilty and, so on and so forth. So he basically pretended the problem wasn't nearly as bad as it actually is in terms of numbers and the types of sexual misconduct. But the worst thing he did, in my mind, is he brazenly lied about sexual abuse of children. I had communicated with Jim Key in 2013 towards the end of getting the Unitarian Universalist Association to formally withdraw its false blasphemous libel accusation against me and apologize for it and disclose the truth about just how many children had been raped by Unitarian Universalist ministers, how many victims there were of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, how many Unitarian Universalist ministers were guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. So I spoke at some length with Jim Key in an hour-and-a-half long phone call in September 2013 about these issues. And I told him about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, I told him about Richard Buell, I told him about other Unitarian Universalist ministers who'd been charged, tried, and convicted specifically of the sexual abuse of children. Towards the end, as I said, of settling our dispute at the personal level, but also in terms of exposing the truth to the public and to the larger Unitarian Universalist Church. And Jim Key totally ignored that, and in his apology he said the following words: there were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations. So that's an exact quote, one more time. There were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations. I don't think Jim was saying that he didn't abuse any children or elders in his investigations. Oh, that's one way of interpreting that phrase. I think what he meant was, I personally investigated clergy sexual misconduct in the Unitarian Universalist religious community, and I found no evidence of any sexual abuse of children or sexual abuse of elders in my own investigations. This is outright brazen, bald-faced lie because A, I personally told Jim Key about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell being charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape and indeed the unnatural rape of teenage Tibetan refugees who he had lured away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America, lured away from their fathers, and became a surrogate, sexually abusing father himself. So anyway, Jim knew about that. And I also told him of a few other cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers had been specifically charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children. So Jim Key was aware of cases of sexual abuse of children just in terms of what I personally communicated to him. But it's almost inconceivable that nobody else told him about sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers. It's almost inconceivable that Reverend Deborah Pope Lance and other advocates for victims of clergy misconduct didn't tell Jim Key about sexual abuse of children. So he just brazenly lied in what was supposed to be an apology. So that's how, one of the ways anyway, in which Unitarian Universalists officially deny sexual abuse of children committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers. And we're not even talking about Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers and lay people here. That's you know, just more abuse to talk about. So that's it. I think we're going to wrap this up. We've been going for 15 minutes in this monologue, and I'm going to go and re-chalk the other slogan that got a little erased. I'm just going to quickly zoom in on this. This is a picket sign protesting the fact that Montreal Unitarian Sue Montgomery, who was the Gazette's justice reporter, absolutely outright refused to write a report about the Unitarian Universalist Association's false blasphemous libel accusation against me, which sought to conceal such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers like Mac Malls Mitchell and so on, to say nothing of trying to cover up Richard Buell's despicable pedophile rape of preteen children, including a female family member. So Sue, I brought this to her attention on December 6th of 2012, if not earlier, but certainly on December 6th of 2012, a day dedicated to speaking out against violence against women and girls. I brought this to the attention of Sue Montgomery, who I happened to run into at a vigil in front of the Palais de Justice here in Montreal. So she was there to report on this vigil, which was against the violence against the women and girls. And I would think that sexual abuse would be one form of violence against women and girls. And so I told Sue, she was there, and I said, "Hey Sue, I got a story for you." And I told her what I just recounted in this thing, and yet she totally refused to report the story. And on top of that, she helped make sure that nobody else reported the story. So that's what this is all about. It's 2 columns, just like a newspaper. And on that note, we're wrapping this up now.